I'm going to read a story from my book, Dear Frickin' Fear. And this chapter is a short story called Around the Lake. On days like today, when I wake up before the sun, I enjoy the calm of the dawn. There's peace as the things that go bump in the night head off to their resting places, while the daywalkers begin to stir. It's times like these that the deep smell of freshly brewed coffee seems to fill up my entire body. Having the first sip of the steamy nectar while I'm sitting on my porch tastes like paradise. Even though it's the weekend, it's good that my body woke me up early because I plan to walk around the lake to visit my grandma and her mother. I'm not sure how much longer my great-grandmother will be around. She's approaching her 100th birthday, and her health isn't faring as well as it used to. I shook my head to remove those thoughts from my mind so that I could focus on brighter things. I took a large drink of my coffee and emptied the cup. Time to get at it. The path around the lake to the small town where my grandma lives is not a short walk, but it's a beautiful one. You can see the water from the path the entire way, and there are trees and aromatic flowers flanking the trail. I hadn't gone far before I came across an elderly man who was walking with a limp. He had a broken cane in his hands and was slowly trying to make his way along the trail without falling. He heard me coming, so he stopped and carefully turned to see who was behind him. "Howdy there, sir," I greeted him with a smile. He responded in a gruff voice, but was friendly. "Good morning, little man." Well, I wasn't little, but I figured he meant to point out that I was much younger than him. "Having some trouble there with your walking stick?" I asked. He laughed as he responded, "Well, yes, this old friend has been with me since the war, but it seems I have outlasted him." "Could you use a strong arm to help you back to your house?" I offered. "It seems like the big kahuna has smiled down on me today. I would appreciate that, but I'm going to the small town around the lake if that isn't too far," he replied. "Not at all. I'm headed there myself," I replied and offered him my arm. "I'm very appreciative, young sir." "Please, call me Dan." "Thank you, Dan. You can call me Will." "So, Will, what brings you on this path?" I asked him. "I'm on my way to visit an old friend of mine. I haven't seen her in quite some time. She lives in the small town over yonder," he replied. "Won't that be a nice surprise? Does she know you're coming?" He grinned. "I haven't told her I'm coming, but she always was a bit intuitive." I continued with small talk. "Where are you coming from?" "I've been traveling to see all my loved ones, but this is my last stop. She's my truest love," he shared, and his deep love shone on his face. "Ah, that's fantastic. I'm very happy for you. Better late than never, eh?" I said. "Why, yes. I firmly believe that things happen when they will. Things just are. There's no supposed to. Every single moment of my life has been about love or about my fear of losing love." This intrigued me, so I questioned his theory. "Every moment?" "Yes, every single moment. Give it a try. Think about a situation." Oh boy, good thing I had my coffee this morning because this man was going to make me think. "All right then. I'll skip the obvious things like feeling betrayed by your mate and someone giving you a gift from the heart. How about when someone gets angry when things don't go their way? That doesn't sound like a love moment or a fear moment." The old man thought for a time, as if he was gathering his thoughts, and then replied, "When you take any situation and drill down to its deepest root, you'll either find unconditional love or the fear of losing conditional love from someone, whether it's another person or your creator. The root of anger is fear as well. May I explain?" I nodded as I was interested in his revelation. He continued, "What triggers anger is the fight or flight mode. The fight mode triggers adrenaline and gives us the tint of battle in our bones. Fight or flight is triggered by our perceived fears. Some can be real, like a vicious dog staring us down and inching in toward us, but most of our fears are emotional. When we define ourselves by anything external, we feel the need to protect the outcomes or definitions of those external things and avoid being viewed as unacceptable and unlovable. So anger is our defensive response to the fear of rejection. Okay, let me see if I'm getting this straight, I cheekily responded. If I define myself by external things, then I'll be angry all the time. He looked at me, then down at his broken cane, then back at me again, and then he smirked, silently warning me that he knew a smart aleck when he saw one. That's one way, he said in a measured voice, adding, we go through these phases to regain control of a situation so we can feel safe. First, we try to make the other person feel sorry for us by acting hurt or disappointed. If that doesn't work, we'll try manipulation by becoming visibly angry or upset. Then, if we still aren't in control, we'll try rejecting the other person so they'll beg us to stay. If the first time through that process doesn't work, we may go through it all again and again. That sounds so manipulative, I said, as I drifted off, thinking of my own actions and intentions over the years. He was silent for a while, as if he knew what I was doing in my head. Oh my goodness, you're right, I realized. He grinned, smiling brightly, and seemed glad that I'd processed the information and had come to the same conclusion. He continued, we're a species who follow a tribe mentality. We want to belong, to be loved, and to never be alone. When we're young, a people-pleasing attitude is instilled in us by our leaders and caretakers through praise and punishment. Much of what we're taught is designed to help us survive until we're old enough to take care of ourselves. But then, when we're old enough, we can break from those conditional love laws and choose to be who we want to be. But it's difficult because the fear of rejection is so ingrained that we find it hard to see things differently. We're blinded by our conditioning and having had everything defined for us by others. What are conditional love laws? I asked. He patiently explained. Throughout childhood, we encounter many situations where those around us, our parents, peers, siblings, teachers, actors, books, and all that, instruct us to do the right things and to avoid the bad things. This is reinforced through praise when we do what they want and through punishment when we don't, thus conditioning our mentality towards situations and behaviors. An example is like when we get a flat tire. We're conditioned to believe that it's a bad thing and that we should become upset and kick the tire, say some choice words, and then recount the story to others about how a bad thing just happened to us. In reality, there are no good or bad things or situations. We just have to remember that we get to choose what they mean to us without adopting anyone else's opinion about it. It's just the fear of rejection that compels us to fit in with common beliefs about what situations should mean. Well, how could a flat tire be any good? I countered. And maybe the flat tire delayed you, helping you to avoid a speeding ticket or a fatal accident. Maybe it delayed you so that you would later bump into a friend you hadn't seen in a long time. Or maybe if the tire hadn't flattened, it would have blown out while you were driving, causing you to force someone else off the road and killing them. And you'd have to live the rest of your days knowing you took someone's life. Wow, I never would have thought of that, I replied, a bit taken aback by the realization that I really might be conditioned to think in certain ways. I thought I was a free-thinking pioneer, but the more I considered it, the more I began to realize that, yeah, I've been going with the flow of earlier conditioning. Maybe I wasn't being very original at all. He paused to catch his breath. Then he asked, "So tell me, Dan, what is heavy on your heart today?" I turned to answer him, and he looked deep into my eyes. "Well, to be honest, I've been thinking about death. My great-grandmother's almost 100, and her health isn't doing too well. I'm not sure how much longer she'll be with us. That's where I'm headed, to visit her and her daughter, my grandmother. I want to spend time with her before she passes." "Oh, what are your thoughts on death, Den?" "Well, it seems like a horrible thing." "Is it?" he questioned. "For whom?" "Death devastates everyone who's left behind and leaves their lives empty." I see what he did there. These weren't my thoughts. I was repeating the conditioned feelings I'd been taught regarding death. "Ah, you're a wise man, Will. How'd you get to be so smart?" I said. "I wouldn't go that far, but I've been called a wise guy before," he said, smiling confidently. "I suppose that I can create my own beliefs about death, then?" I pondered. "Yes, Dan, you can. That's your power." I thought aloud. Death seems to impact people, but all the painful emotions that stem from it seem to be based on fear. Our lives seem devastated if we defined ourselves by the person who died. If we believed they completed us, then their passing causes us to feel incomplete, when in reality, no one can complete us except ourselves. If we perceived that they were helping us to adhere to those conditional love laws, their death creates fear that will no longer be acceptable to others. We become afraid we'll somehow be ostracized from our tribe, and if we were financially dependent on them, then we fear that we won't be able to get by. But when I look at the root of all these things, I see that these fears are lies. We'll be fine. We won't starve or die of thirst or be homeless. Someone would step up to help, and we would be fine even if they didn't. Things may not occur the way we think they should, but we wouldn't die. And those who love us, who truly love us, wouldn't judge or stop loving us. Those who didn't really love us in the first place might reject us, but would that really be a bad thing? I stopped for a moment. "So pain is a lie?" I asked him. Will smiled proudly at how quickly I seemed to be catching on and answered, "Pain is real for everyone. It's part of our journey. However, suffering from that pain is a choice. We can choose to be a victim of our pain and circumstances, or we can choose to seek love, regardless of what is happening in our lives. If circumstances truly controlled what things meant, everyone would experience the same impact. But because we're all react differently to the similar situations, we know that each person going through those circumstances can choose how it will impact them." Holy cow! How have I not heard any of this before? This is life-changing information. Growing up in a world of fear, we become accustomed to it. Our ego learns to accommodate and even thrive on it because we don't want to risk change. That's okay. Fear kept us alive for a time. But now that you know, you can never forget that you know, he said. Will pointed his cane at some beautiful white flowers behind us. Would you mind gathering up a nice batch of those for me? Will asked. I obliged and gathered a nice bouquet. I went to hand them to him, thinking they were for his true love, but he shook his head and said, Give them to your great-grandmother. She will like these, Will added. In my youth, these bloodroot flowers were very special. We continued down the path and came upon a small group of people staring up in a tree with binoculars. They were excitedly whispering. They greeted us, and Will asked them what they were up to. And one of the ladies answered, We're trying to figure out what that is, pointing up at a bird in a tree. Will didn't miss a beat and replied, It looks like a bird. His answer was met with a glare from the lady, and she replied, Well, of course it is a bird. We are trying to determine what kind it is. Again, Will replied while giving me a slight wink. Ah, I see. It appears to be a living bird. The ladies quickly grew impatient with Will's replies. They returned to their large book of bird pictures and wished us both a good day. Wow, they didn't appreciate your sense of humor, did they? I mentioned to Will when we were a bit down the trail. No worries, Den. Most people don't appreciate it when you mess with their attempts to define the world around them by their own standards. Having control of their surroundings helps them feel safe. We arrived at the end of the trail that opened up into a park at the edge of the small town. Will announced that he was a bit early and wanted to sit on a nearby bench to rest until it was time. He wasn't far from our house, so he insisted he would be fine. He urged me to go on. Thanks for being my cane and for our refreshing conversation, Den. And with a strong shake of his hand, I was off to my grandmother's. When I arrived at her house, I knocked on the kitchen door and entered. My grandmother was cooking in the kitchen as she always did, and it smelled like she was baking my favorite chocolate chip oatmeal cookies. Yum! Those smell great, I said as I greeted her with a hug and kissed her cheek. Well, there's my fine-looking grandson, she replied with a bright smile on her face. She looked tired. She sniffed me. What's that? Old Spice? At first I wasn't sure what she was talking about because I don't wear cologne, but then it clicked. Oh, the aftershave smell. Yeah, I helped an older man walk on the path on my way here, so his aftershave must have rubbed off onto my arm. I haven't smelled Old Spice in a very long time, she replied. I halved the bunch of white flowers and gave her one handful. A beautiful, surprised look came over her face as she brought them to her nose to inhale their sweet fragrance. Thank you, they're so pretty. She immediately grabbed 2 vases from a cupboard and put sugar water in them. She placed her flowers in one and handed the other vase to me. I took a fresh baked cookie and stuffed it in my mouth. I looked at her again, and she seemed worried. Everything okay, Grandma? Her smile dimmed. We had a rough night here, she said, not looking up from arranging her flowers. She continued. Her heart gave out a time or two last night. I moved over and put my hand on her shoulder. She turned to me and gave me a big, tight hug. I held her for a moment and felt her sob a bit. She squeezed me tightly and then let go, wiping her tears with her apron. Enough of that. I get so emotional when I'm tired, she said as she forced a smile. You should go up and see her. She's been so excited to see you. I kissed her forehead, grabbed another cookie, and headed upstairs with the vase of flowers in hand. As I climbed the stairs, Will's words echoed through my mind. It's all about choice. I can choose to be happy in this moment, or I can choose to be sad. It's all up to me. I choose joy. I stuck my head inside the open door of my great-grandmother's bedroom. She was gazing out the window, but turned to look at me. She didn't say a word, but the smile on her face and the gleam in her eyes spoke volumes. I walked over to her and bent down to give her a hug and a kiss on her cheek. I gave her the bloodroot flowers, and her eyes brightened up even more. Her voice was a whisper, but I could make out most of what she said. "These are my favorite flowers. My husband William used to bring them to me all the time. That's a picture of him over on the wall." "William? I thought she was married to a man named Francis." I took a quick glance at the picture. I'd never met Francis because he died in the war many years before I was born. Chills ran through me, and the hair stood up all over my body. Will? Could it be? She shifted the conversation to something else and brought me back from my thoughts. I chatted with her for an hour or so about what was going on in my life, and we made small talk about the birds that were chirping outside her window. Her time was spent mainly in bed these days, and her life had become very simple. She had a glow of peace on her face. She became tired and began to doze off, so I kissed her forehead and whispered that I'd be back in the morning to see her again. Downstairs in the kitchen, Grandma had packed some cookies to go. Chatted a bit with her over a cup of coffee before I headed out to run some errands in the small town. I asked her about this man named William. "Oh yes, that was my dad. His name was Francis William, but he was teased so much about Francis growing up that I always went by his middle name." I didn't mention my thoughts of the man I met on the road. Certainly, many men of his age were in the war, and Will was a common name. I headed out to run my errands, letting Grandma know that I'd be back in the morning to spend the day with them. After a few hours, my errands were complete, and I headed back to the lake path. Will was no longer sitting on the bench. As I walked along the path back home, I caught up to a young man in a military uniform walking alongside an older woman. The closer I got, the more it looked like the young man from the photo, wearing a uniform from World War II. When I finally caught up to them, they turned around. The old woman was my great-grandmother. When I looked into the eyes of the young man, they were those of the old man, Will. "Grandma? Will?" I was in utter shock. They smiled at me. Will bent down to pick up the bags I'd just dropped. I hadn't even realized that my arms had gone limp. "Hang in there, Den. Take some deep breaths," Will urged. My great-grandma gave me a big hug. She seemed younger than a few hours ago. Tears streamed down my face as I realized that Will was indeed my great-grandfather, and that the woman he had come to visit was my great-grandmother. He was fetching her for their next journey. She slipped her arm into mine while Will took her other side, and they pulled me along the path again. "Everything you told me means so much more, Will. You are speaking from experience, aren't you? You're from the other side." "Yes, Dan. Your love for my wife and daughter was so strong that it allowed you to see me. Love energy is an amazing and powerful thing, the most powerful energy in this whole realm." "Grandma, does this mean you're leaving us?" She turned her head as we walked and looked into my eyes. There was a great peace there and a deep love I had not seen in her before. "Yes, my dearest boy, I'm ready to head back and continue the reflection on my life." "Reflection?" I questioned. "Now that I've left my physical body, I'm free from my ego pain body that allowed me to experience so many things in this life. Now that I'm remembering my spirit body, I'm able to compare the difference between conditional and unconditional love. It's why we all come here," she said with a wink. She looked like she had grown a little younger. She continued, "I see now that I had such strong rules governing who I was supposed to be. My childhood was a strict one, where I was taught to be prim and proper and have things just so. We were a generation controlled by the fear of what others would think. I suppose each generation is, in some way. Seeing this now helps me understand the breadth of unconditional love and the freedom we have to be ourselves. I couldn't respond. My mind was busy taking all of this in, and all I could do was keep looking over at her every few steps. And each time I looked, she grew younger and younger. We were married 8 years before Will entered the military. Our daughter was just 7 years old when the war started and he was deployed. It was about a year after that we received word that he had been killed in battle. I was such an adventurer when I was younger. I wanted to see the world, but I followed the widow's creed of suffering instead. I felt sorry for myself for many years until I felt I was too old and it was too late. I never acted on any of the love I felt for the rest of my life except with my family. This time when I looked over, she was the same age as young Will. Life is about experience. It's not what happens in our lives, but what it tells us about ourselves. Our feelings are indicators for us to look more deeply inside ourselves. She stopped and let go of Will, taking both of my hands in hers. Den, the guilt the living adopt after someone dies is not of love. It's based in a fear that we've been conditioned to practice throughout the ages. It's something we also want to experience here, but when we return to the realm of unconditional love, there's no fear or negative feelings towards anyone. She paused, then asked, "Can you do me a favor?" "Yes, Grandma, anything." "Please let our daughter know that we're so proud of her. I wish I told her that more often. We'll always be near her. Tell her that her father came here to welcome me. Please thank her for all she did for me, especially in these last days. It was very rough for her, but she made me very comfortable and gave me so much love." We had reached the end of the path. They both pulled me into them and hugged me so tightly. I was flooded with overwhelming, unconditional love. As they departed, they said, "Remember, we're always with you and our family." Then they were gone in a blink. I didn't fear death any longer. Bliss surrounded me. I smiled with tears in my eyes as I walked swiftly back to my house. I put down the bags, grabbed my car keys, and rushed back over to my grandma's house. I had a message for her, and I wasn't sure if she'd found my great-grandmother's body lying peacefully in her bed yet. When I arrived, she was sitting in the kitchen, sipping hot tea. She looked at me curiously, wondering why I was back. She saw the tears in my eyes, and somehow she knew. She came over, grabbed my hand, and we climbed the stairs to her mother's bedroom. When we entered the room, a picture frame had fallen off the wall and was laying on the floor face down. As my grandmother moved over to check on her mom, I picked up the frame. It was the picture of a very young Will in his military uniform. My grandma turned to me with tears in her eyes. "She's gone." "Grandma, sit down. I have something to tell you." I hope you enjoyed this story. It touches me every time that I read it myself. Just remember, you are loved.